All right, there is a lot of material to cover today. I mean, in a way, there's only one real subject, at least for the first half of the lecture, which is the genesis of the Ruhr crisis. You should definitely write this term down of 1923. But to explain it, I'm going to go through the whole saga, basically leading from the Versailles Treaty up to the dramatic so-called beer hall putsch of November 1923, to explain how it all goes together. You know, how you get from the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty, the reparations payments levied upon the Germans, to eventually a major diplomatic crisis, a tremendous political drama, money being pushed around in wheelbarrows, and eventually Hitler jumping up onto a table with a beer stein in his hand. So we want to basically explain how you get from one to the other. I should have written one more important term here. That being the Dolchstoßlegende in German, which we're going to anglicize as the stab in the back legend. I'm also going to write one more term up here next to Hitler. We're going to use this key term. It's one of his favorite phrases. The quote-unquote November criminals. Now, I already explained a little bit last week some of the international context of this rise of anti-Semitism and paranoia in Central Europe, especially in Germany. A much larger factor, though, at least that was particular to Germany, was the way the war had ended, or to put it more precisely, the way the war had ended compared to what people's expectations were in Germany. Now, if you remember, earlier in 1918, that is, before Germany had lost the war, she had in effect won the war in the East. Remember, Russia had surrendered. Germany had severed huge portions of Russia. Almost the entirety of European Russia, including its most prosperous areas, most of its coal-producing regions, also where a lot of the iron deposits were located, where most of Russian heavy industry was. Germany had essentially ripped Russia apart and not annexed it technically. They were running it through a series of satellite states. But essentially, Germany seemed to have won the war. German propaganda, as you might expect, heralded all of this as a great triumph and a feat of German arms. Germans who read newspapers thought they were winning the war, with fairly good reason, right up until the collapse in September, October, brought about mostly, again, because of the morale problem, the collapse in morale wrought by the arrival of 4 million Americans. The term I didn't give you yet, but which is kind of a funny term. The Americans were called dough boys, dough being what you use to make bread. If you've ever seen that commercial, you probably haven't because it's American, for the Pillsbury man. You know, they sell these little bread rolls, and he's like, well, we got all this fat. He's kind of jolly and fat. Anyway, this was the cliche. You know, the Europeans have been starving for 4 years, and then these well-fed, they're not fat, they're sort of like fit but, you know, full-bodied Americans come over, the doughboys. You know, just shocking everyone with their weird enthusiasm and excitement about the war. Germans, of course, basically went the opposite way. They kind of collapsed and didn't want to fight anymore. Well, when you put all of this together, along with the stuff about Wilson and the 14 points, with the Germans, remember, somewhat cynically had decided, oh, well, maybe we'll surrender if the Americans will give us a deal, so that a lot of Germans thought they were going to get a much better deal at Versailles than they did. Then you also put that together with the cynical way in which the German generals, particularly Erich von Ludendorff, had decided to surrender power to socialist politicians right before the end of the war. That is, so it wasn't the generals who surrendered, you see. It wasn't the army that was beaten, you see. It was the politicians. It was Friedrich Ebert, the Social Democrats, and of course the Jews, quote unquote. Yes, there were many Jewish socialist leaders. Ebert himself was not Jewish. Many of the other top leadership were. This is where this whole legend originated. The German phrase, very evocative, is the Dolchstoßlegende, the idea that the German people I suppose the army and then by proxy the German people had been stabbed in the back by the politicians. That is, the Germans, through their own courage and bravery and feats of arms, had won the war, and then the politicians had lost it for them. The politicians had surrendered to the Allies. Hitler's phrase that he liked to use, he called them the November criminals. November 1918 being, of course, the time of the armistice, November 11th to be precise. That is, that these evil cabal of sort of Jewish come socialist politicians had surrendered to the Allies unjustly, thus stabbing Germany in the back. It was all, of course, a gross, a preposterous lie, considering the fact that it was the generals themselves who had essentially abdicated authority, had essentially fled. So in order not to take the responsibility for the defeat, the Allies, in fact, had occupied the main bridgeheads of the Rhine River, thus basically were waiting to pour into Germany. In fact, it's an interesting what-if question. You have to understand when you look at this that people are always fighting the last war. You can begin to see in some of this controversy the seeds of the policy in the Second World War, which will be the opposite. The policy of unconditional surrender. That is the policy that FDR and Churchill and then Stalin decided on. That is, we will not let the Germans squirm away again, claiming they weren't really beaten. So what they did, of course, in the Second World War is they flattened Germany to the ground. I mean, they literally bombed out all of the cities. Berlin turned into rubble in the course of one of the most brutal battles in human history. In the First World War, Germany didn't suffer quite so badly. Here was another part of the confusion. Although France had, quote-unquote, won the war, France was in ruins. The whole northeastern section of the country had been occupied for 4 years. The farms were destroyed. The buildings were charred rubble. The war had been fought in France, on French soil, over French soil, along with, of course, parts of Belgium. And so it was the French who had suffered. The Germans, even though they lost, had never really suffered the direct impact of the war. So many of them like to believe they had not really lost. You know, Hitler was by no means the only one to make this argument. It's just he was sort of much more raving mad than everyone else. You know, he didn't just say, oh, they stabbed us in the back, and it's too bad, but those damn politicians did it to us again. He said the November criminals should be strung up and hung. They should be literally killed and murdered and mutilated. I mean, he was really extreme about it. But of course, a lot of people felt that way, so he struck a chord. And the fact that he was able to focus in on this scapegoat, the bankers, the Jews, made it that much more potent as rhetoric. But Hitler, to be frank, wasn't really much of a factor for the first couple of years after Versailles. It took the Ruhr crisis to really turn him into a kind of international celebrity and a major politician in Germany. So I'm going to explain how we got to the Ruhr crisis and what it was. Now, the big issues opened up by the Versailles Treaty. Some of them were territorial. You know, it wasn't just that they were complaining that they hadn't lost the war. They were also complaining that Germany was truncated. That is, its borders had, of course, been reduced. If you look in this war, right here in this little pocket, just to the south of the Saarbrücken, or the Saar, kind of near Strasbourg, you know, home of the European Parliament, you have this territory of Alsace-Lorraine. Known today mostly for its fabulous food and excellent white wines, it was, of course, at that time known more as the political football, which in a sense had been one of the major causes of the First World War. This was the territory the Germans had taken from France in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, so that France then lamented its loss. That's one of the reasons why the French were so motivated to fight in 1914. In fact, there's a good line about Alsace-Lorraine. It's like two provinces, and you remember Bismarck had this cynical strategy of trying to get everyone interested in Africa so that they wouldn't gang up on Germany. And a lot of people in France went along with this in the kind of great stage of colonization in Africa. But the line was this. It was this nationalist politician who said he was tired of hearing about the glories of French colonization in Africa. Africa, he said, was nothing. You know, he said, you've stolen from me 2 sisters, and you offer me 20 chambermaids. That is, you offer me Africa, but we lost Alsace-Lorraine. Well, now after the war, France gains it back. curiously, you'd think this would be a big sticking point for the Germans. But in fact, most Germans accepted it as not really that big of a deal. In part because Germany had done so well on the Eastern Front. It was the territories lost in the East which really grated on the nationalists. You know, they had conquered Russia and then been forced to give it up. They had not only been forced to give up Russia, but huge sections of what was then East Prussia were now Poland. Other territories were given to the new state of Czechoslovakia. The key territory which will emerge in the 1930s as a kind of a hot flashpoint is the Sudetenland. You can see this kind of just south of Dresden, you know, kind of towards Prague. Now, it's not that this was historically a part of Germany. It's that there were a lot of Germans living there. You remember this issue of irredentism, the notion that everyone of a single nationality should be united in the same borders. There were now huge German minorities in Czechoslovakia and Poland, and even more than that, there was this huge chunk of land called the Polish Corridor, which now literally split up the kind of scattered remnants of what was still East Prussia with the rest of Germany, which was, of course, rather close to Berlin. The Poles actually had fought a series of wars after the First World War from about 1919 up to about 1922. They kept expanding their borders. Germany then felt put upon, oppressed, as if the Germans, again, had been unjustly punished for the war. In some ways, though, the reparations issue was even more important. This was, if you remember, the notion that the Germans were supposed to pay damages. In part because, again, the so-called war guilt clause, Clause 231 of the Versailles Treaty, said that Germany was to blame for the war. Now, the reparations, you're going to see a lot of figures bandied about. There's one figure called, you'll sometimes see 132 billion gold marks, or GM. Now, there are different ways of translating it. It's all a bit confusing because the mark was in the course of kind of hyperinflating. The eventual sum that they settled on in dollar terms, the French wanted much, much, much more. But eventually the French were forced to settle for a sum of about 12.5 billion US dollars, which to us doesn't sound like all that much. You know that Austin Powers movie, you know, where he falls asleep in 1967 and he wakes up like 30 years later and, you know, he's still this international criminal, and so he holds, I don't know, somebody hostage with a nuclear bomb or something, and he says, "I want you to give me $1 million. And then his aides whisper to him, "Actually, that's not really all that much money anymore." And so he then says, "Okay, $1 billion. It's a little bit like that. To us, $12.5 billion doesn't sound like all that much. In contemporary terms, my own calculations would have it somewhere around $1 trillion or $2. But even that doesn't really get the size of it. To give you an idea of how much money this seemed to be at the time, the entire amount of gold held by all of the governments of the world, that is the gold reserves, which were supposed to back up everyone's currency, amounted to only about $6 billion. That is money in circulation. If everyone was pegged to gold, which they no longer were, that meant the French were asking for twice the amount of all the gold in the world from Germany. Now, if you look at it from the French perspective, that still wasn't enough. France had to spend about $4 billion just on the reconstruction of the areas of France that had been destroyed in the war. This was, of course, not to mention the war debts France had incurred, all of the money they'd had to pay to fight the war, the fact that they had done the most suffering by far in the war. Proportionate to their population, they had lost more soldiers than anyone else, about 1.4 million soldiers. In addition to, and this is perhaps more significant, the figure of 1.1 million. These were the mutilés, that is, men who had not only been injured, but who had like lost an arm or a leg. And you saw them on the streets of France, Paris, and other cities for the next 20 years. They were a major fixture of, I mean, you'd be reminded of it every day as you walk past them. And France insisted, obviously, that it needed to pay them well, not only for their service, but also their sacrifice. And that, in addition to all of the debts France had incurred, ordinary government expenditures, $4 billion just to reconstruct all of the damaged property and roads and bridges. The French thought this was actually not nearly enough. Of course, the Germans had their own argument, which was, first of all, we weren't really guilty, so we shouldn't pay at all. And second of all, we have the same kind of debts that you have, and so we can't pay our own expenses, let alone all of yours. Now, the reparations issue was in some ways linked to the issue of war debts. Most Europeans saw it as part of the same sort of issue. The war had obviously cost lots of money. France wanted reparations in part so that it could pay its own debts. The Americans, who were basically the ones who, if you look at that chart, America emerges not only as the world's greatest creditor, but by a process of almost kind of like this, osmosis, just general process of America benefiting from the war, American arms being sold, America running a huge trade surplus. Wow, America running a trade surplus. I can't believe I just said that. Did that actually happen once? That hasn't been true in decades, but yes, it was true. America had essentially hoarded most of the world's gold. You can see there, before the war, America had at most maybe a third or so. As I had said, it was something like, in 1913, about $5 billion worth of gold held by the central banks. America holds about a third, maybe a little more than a third, maybe like 35%, a little bit less than $2 billion in gold. By the end of the war, the Americans have about 4.2, and then eventually it gets up to about $4.5 billion in gold reserves. The U.S., as you can see, is on the bottom here. This is the big chunk. Meanwhile, the other countries, Germany has basically gone to insignificance, the UK is a little less, and France's gold reserves have dwindled. Basically, the Americans hold all the gold now. America holds all the debt, too. Most of the other allies, and I think I mentioned this before, like France and some of the other countries like Romania, which were in the war, and Italy, most of them had initially borrowed money from Britain. Britain had then in turn borrowed money from the US. So most of the countries which had fought in the war and done most of the fighting thought, well, look, yes, we want the Germans to pay reparations, but this issue should be linked to the whole question of war debts. And the whole thing would be much easier to arrange, most of them thought, especially the French, and also the British, if America would simply forgive the debts. If America could forgive the debts that Britain owed it, then Britain could in turn forget the debts the other countries owed it, and then they wouldn't go bankrupt, and then maybe eventually the Germans might actually cough up some of the money that the French were asking for. As it was, basically nobody had any money, and everybody owed the Americans money, or the British. The Germans, well, the Germans rather cynically decided to just kind of hold up their middle finger to everybody, not simply by not paying, by missing most of their payments, but by deliberately hyperinflating their currency. So that not only would they appear to be poor, but so what they basically did with their own debts is they just inflated them away. Which was also a way of holding up a middle finger to their own citizens, because most of Germany's public debt was held by Germans. And the German government just eventually hyperinflated the currency to the point where it could pay off everything at, you've heard the phrase maybe like a penny to the dollar or like a kurush to the lira. In the German case, it was like a fraction of a kurush to the lira. Eventually, the German currency stabilized. I'll get to the story in a minute after the Ruhr crisis. It stabilized at 4.2 trillion to the dollar. Not billion. Trillion. Trillion. I think you do have that word in Turkish. Actually, you needed this word a few years ago. When you, that's right, back when I was a billionaire here. That was kind of fun. But eventually they lopped off the zeros of the currency here, just like they did in Germany. But so, the Germans then basically don't have any desire to pay. The Russians, meanwhile, the genesis of the famous Rapallo Agreement lies in part in the fact that the Germans owe all this money they don't want to pay. The Russians, meanwhile, owe even more money. This is another reason why the French think that they have a good case. I talked about the money the Germans were supposed to pay the French. The Russians owed the French something like $4 billion US. Now, in their case, it was a lot simpler than the Germans trying to, not pay and then inflate their currency. The Russians, well, I said held up their middle finger. I suppose the Germans maybe held it up about a third of the way. The Russians held it up all the way. They basically told everyone to just screw off. They literally canceled all of their debts. They just said, screw you, we're not going to pay ever. Well, they were Bolsheviks after all. They had also annihilated private property and abolished the use of money, so it wasn't like an entirely absurd step to go all the way to just basically saying we will not pay any of our debts. They were still arguing about this in the 1980s with the Soviet Union, because France had invested the vast bulk of really its kind of available capital. A lot was also invested in the Ottoman Empire. But basically almost all of Russia's government debt, its municipal bonds, huge sectors of industry and the railroads had all been financed by the French. Not just the French government. There were something like 1.5 million bondholders in France. That is, people who had invested their life savings in Russia. And then the Bolsheviks just basically say, F you. You're screwed. So France has basically lost this much from the Russians. It's lost this much just in terms of like war damage. It has to pay those 1.1 million sort of mutilés. The Germans are refusing to pay. So France, you can imagine, is getting pretty angry at the Germans. But curiously, in a way, they get even more angry at the Americans and the English. Or as the French like to call them in disgust, les Anglo-Saxons. Well, why was that? Basically because the French did not get the backing that they wanted. Ultimately, it all depended on the Americans, because the Americans were the ones who held all the cards. The Americans had all the gold. The Americans held the vast majority of inter-allied debt. But the Americans, if you remember, had sort of bowed out of European affairs. Wilson had been massively repudiated. Well, first he had a stroke and became an invalid, and then his wife became president, as you remember. But after that, of course, his party was destroyed in the 1920 elections. Warren Harding will emerge. I'll talk more about him next week. He's actually a very interesting figure. But in terms of foreign policy, his essential policy was not to have one. His campaign slogans were all about normalcy. That was his key word. That is, not nostrums, but normalcy. We will return to basically minding our own business, which actually had certain things to be said for it. But in inter-allied terms, it was not very helpful. Coolidge, his successor, had an even more colorful phrase, which was, the business of America is business. In other words, we're not going to get wrapped up in all of these kind of faraway disputes and deals with the Europeans. Remember, America does not even belong to the League of Nations. So in a sense, America has kind of left the Europeans on their own. Remember, they gave the French this kind of vague promise of collective security. You can just trust us. The moral opinion of the world will save you if the Germans attack you. And even that was supposed to be via the League of Nations, and then America didn't even join the League of Nations. Now, in the case of the British, it's a little bit more complicated. Some of it has to do with, Britain's own problems. Now, Britain was not in as bad a situation as France after the war, financially speaking. However, Britain now had massive obligations around the world. The British Empire was now larger than it had ever been before, although the British were now deeply in debt to the Americans and could barely afford to pay their ordinary expenses, let alone things like suppressing uprisings in the Indian Raj in Iraq. There's a big uprising in Mesopotamia in 1920. The British are now trying to garrison the entire Middle East, only they don't really have much of an army anymore. So eventually they do the cheapest thing, which is to just kind of send in warplanes and bomb from the sky. I mean, the British, they're not broke exactly, but they're in a very difficult position financially. The British currency has basically fallen off the gold standard. You can look at this other chart here. You can see part of the reasons for the divergence, both of financial terms, but also eventually of a kind of almost a moral divergence between the US and UK on the one hand and the French on the other. Basically, the UK eventually decided, Britain eventually decided to go back onto the gold standard. Mostly for reasons of prestige. London had been the world's capital of finance. I mean, to some extent, it still is today in terms of volume of trading. But now, of course, New York and Wall Street had emerged as the world's creditor. They were really controlling most of the levers of international finance. The other thing is that the pound had fallen against the dollar. Now, originally, back in the proper gold standard up to 1914, the pound and the dollar were both pegged to gold, and the rate between the dollar and the pound was about $4.86, just a little below $5 to the pound. it had fallen down to like 2 or 3 after the war. This is partly because, remember, America now has all the gold. America's economy is much stronger than in Europe. And so basically people want to hold dollars, which pushes the dollar up, and people don't trust the pound sterling. Eventually, the British decided to make great sacrifices, essentially to artificially try to go back to this rate of exchange, a strong pound, that is, for reasons of prestige and finance. The downside of that, of course, was that it actually hurt a lot of workers. It caused a lot of unemployment, simply because British prices were so high that British goods were not as competitive around the world. There's usually a trade-off when it comes to monetary policy like that. But Britain eventually chose basically hard money, almost an overvalued pound, so that Britain could return to the gold standard. Now, the problem with the gold standard, there were a lot of problems with going back to it. Basically, if you can see here, the amount of gold actually held by banks had only gone up by about 20% during the war, from about $5 billion to about $6 billion. But everyone had been cranking up the printing presses, especially the Germans. So now prices had gone up. You had inflation. Theoretically, money was supposed to be backed by gold issuance, so that the overall money supply was supposed to remain basically constant. Now, this all affected prices, of course. If a country such as the UK decided that it wanted to go back on the gold standard, then effectively this reduced the amount of money in circulation, which led to what was called deflation. Deflation, I think I wrote it up here, but you probably know the term. Inflation, here it is. Hyperinflation, deflation, I'm blocking it. The US pretty much was on the same path because the US also chose basically hard money in the gold standard. The French chose a kind of middle path. They didn't hyperinflate the currency like the Germans did. Eventually, their currency stabled at about 25 francs to the dollar, which was actually 5 times higher than it had been before the war. So it goes from 5 to 25 francs to the dollar. So France has this kind of lower prices, which makes France competitive. But on the other hand, France doesn't really have a lot of gold, and it's not really properly on the gold standard. Well, all of this stuff, again, it sounds sort of boring and arcane, but it had serious consequences for international politics. The reason France felt it couldn't go back to the gold standard was because it wasn't getting any help from the Americans or the British. They weren't helping to enforce reparations. They weren't forcing the Germans to pay. They were, in fact, even talking to the Germans almost constantly at all of these conferences about restructuring the debt. France basically felt betrayed by its allies. They haven't given it security guarantees. They didn't seem to be fully behind even backing the new borders. And more than that, they weren't forcing the Germans to pay reparations. Now, all of this eventually leads to a kind of almost cycle of tension, which just gets worse and worse. Partly as, of course, the inflation in Germany gets worse. By 1922, the German mark has kind of gone past the point of no return. Von Havenstein, who is this, basically I think he's gone senile. He's the head of the Reichsbank. And he goes from having a kind of pseudo-deliberate policy of inflating the currency to just like going out of his mind with this stuff, where they're literally printing billions and then trillions of Deutschmarks every day. Eventually they're just turning out these like cheap productions, and everyone's carrying them around in wheelbarrows, basically. And it's like you get paid, and then you have to run by something within, 5 minutes. I mean, you're literally sprinting. Because in a half an hour, your money might have lost 20% of its value. In an hour, it might have lost 100% of its value. Now, if you can imagine what this does to people's minds, I suppose here in Turkey you had some experience of it. Well, you were all pretty young, but around 2001, 2002. That wasn't even nearly as bad as the German hyperinflation of the early 1920s. But we have to remember, I mean, these are Germans we're talking about. These are like super serious, hard-working people, many of whom have basically denied themselves pleasures, to save money, which is what you're supposed to do, right? Kind of bourgeois values. You save money and you maybe invest it in government bonds or something, because that's what a good German is supposed to do. And now your money is worthless. Even worse than that, people who are clever, many of them Jewish, again by reputation, and it is true a lot of them were Jewish, they go out and they speculate. They maybe have a foreign currency. They speculate against the mark. They use the proceeds to buy real estate or oil. Kind of like everyone's trying to do right now, in fact. Basically because you don't trust the money. But then you hold on to these assets, and then 2 years later, you're a millionaire, just like that. It's unfair. You have these sudden reversals of fortune. Eventually, what's going to happen in politics is people are going to go to the extremes. You know, the communists, even though they keep screwing things up, like in 1921, remember I said they blew up the toilet in their own offices to set off this uprising, and they lost 100,000 members. I mean, even the communists, for all their stupidity, are gaining votes, basically because they're extreme. You know, they want to end capitalism. On the other side of the spectrum, kind of, you remember how I talked about how the Nazis, you know, the actual phrase was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And many of their members were poor or unemployed. It was a little bit like this. I mean, they weren't all working class in the sense of having jobs. The Nazis tended to attract a lot of unemployed people, in part because basically you got to have as a job as like a professional brawler. Like you'd go get in fights and they would pay you to do this. I mean, they literally would they would go like break up a Labor Party rally, the socialists or the communists, and just start beating people up, you know, because it was fun. And then vice versa. All of the parties, in fact, the SPD, the KPD, this is the communists, the NSDAP, and then even some of the more mainstream parties, they actually all had paramilitary branches that were kind of like devoted to street fighting. In part because, if you remember, another clause of the Versailles Treaty, aside from reparations and the loss of territory, Germany's army had been reduced to 100,000. An army which had been in the millions during the war was now 100,000. So you have surplus weapons floating around. Massive numbers, millions of weapons on the black market. So you have street violence of a political nature, you have hyperinflation, and then all of this is kind of coming together when in January of 1923, the French finally lose patience. The fact that the Germans aren't paying them. And so France actually sends in troops. They already have some troops in Germany, but they occupy, you could just barely see it on the map. It's usually called the Ruhr crisis because they went into the area around the Ruhr and Essen, which was sort of like the heartland of German industry. You know, you're talking about coal production, iron, heavy industry basically, along with the raw materials which supply it. And the French said, look, if you're not going to pay us in cash, we will take payment in kind. That is, we will simply take what you produce. We're going to take your coal. We're going to take your steel. Well, the Germans, led by their chancellor, a guy called Wilhelm Kuno, they declared a policy of quote-unquote passive resistance. What this basically meant was, you want our coal and our steel. Fine, we won't produce any. It was a general strike ordered by the government. The government basically ordered its own citizens not to work so that the French would not get what they wanted. And the amazing thing about this policy is it actually worked, more or less. The French were not even able to cover their own occupation expenses because there was so little being produced. Now, meanwhile, what about all those workers who aren't working? They probably need to be paid, right? Well, so the German government decided to pay them. How? By printing money. That is, printing even more money. So in the course of the Ruhr crisis, the mark goes from a few thousand to the dollar to a few million to the dollar, to the point where by September, it's in the billions. You know, an American comes and kind of visits Germany. You know, you pull out your wallet, $10 bill. You could pretty much buy a house. I mean, it was literally crazy. It was like Alice in Wonderland time. In fact, during the beer hall putsch, I'll get to that just in a few minutes. During the beer hall putsch, you know, when Hitler goes to buy a beer, you know, it's like 4.7 billion marks for a beer. I mean, billion. You know, they have to be carting around wheelbarrows of money just to be able to afford basic expenses. So you get a massive hyperinflation. Now, politics already tending to the extreme, went even more to the extreme. But there was one interesting thing about German politics during the Ruhr crisis of 1923. The one thing that kept everything from completely going off the deep end was that the government's policy was actually very popular, as you might expect. You know, the government is basically saying, screw the French. The Germans want to screw the French. So they're actually kind of really happy. There were two parties in Germany which did not support Cuno's policy of passive resistance. Let's see if anyone can guess which of those two parties would be. Two political parties. They don't want to support the government's policy. They're both on the board there. You can kind of guess if you think about it. The KPD and the Nazis. The communists and the Nazis. Again, the usual thing is left and right. That doesn't really make sense if you look at their actual policies. It's more like far left and some kind of radical party which is just as revolutionary, but is a little bit less communist. Basically, the KPD, in fact, the funniest story I thought in all of the Ruhr crisis was that basically the French, banned all of these newspapers from being published because everyone was so anti-French. But they allowed the communists to keep publishing. And so the communist newspapers started printing like insults, like personal insults of like French generals with like caricatures on the front page because they were so embarrassed that their newspapers hadn't been banned. And the reason they didn't support it again is because they just don't support the government because they're communists. The Nazis' position was a little bit more subtle. Hitler basically said, and he was clever in this sense, he realized if our party collaborates with the others, then it won't look very different. We have to distinguish ourselves, by being not only more extreme in our rhetoric, but by the positions that we take. And he actually used this phrase. He made fun of passive resistance. He said it was a policy designed to, quote, kill the French by loafing. Loafing being what you do when you're not doing anything. Loafing around, like what teenagers do when they sit around, or Bilkent students, when you sit around in the cafe, just kind of like drinking coffee or something. And Hitler, he had a point. We're not exactly going to destroy the French by sitting around drinking coffee. It's a silly policy that doesn't accomplish very much. Okay, so towards the end of the crisis, the communists and the Nazis both strike. The communists, as always, struck first, because they were almost always first off the mark when it came to revolutions. Only they did it in a really stupid way. They basically declared their intention to overthrow the government, and they published it in their party newspaper. They said, starting tomorrow, we're going to try to overthrow the government. And so the government responded by saying, okay, then we're just going to arrest all of you. And that was pretty much it. That was in October. So this was the so-called October days. You don't really need to remember this. It's not the most interesting thing the communists do by any stretch of the imagination. The beer hall putsch was, of course, a lot more interesting, not least because of the title. I know we're at the end of the first hour. We'll try to wrap this up with the beer hall putsch because it's kind of dramatic. Now, Hitler, as I said, he didn't really want to work with the other parties. On the other hand, to a certain extent, he had to. The Nazis were not really that popular yet. In national terms, they weren't a very big deal. In Bavaria around Munich, they were now probably the largest political party, but there were just so many other parties that eventually they had to work together. And a lot of these other parties are almost as crazy as the Nazis. They're all sort of like nationalist, racist type parties. The Germans even had a word for this. They call it Völkisch. A word which means something like, like Hulk, kind of like, but sort of like popular with a racist tinge. Germanic, racial, nationalist parties. There are a bunch of them. Hitler is probably the most important of the leaders, but he has to work with the other ones. They eventually form this thing they call the Kampfbund, which is, it's literally like a union of, crazy nationalist, racist paramilitary groups. And they all have guns, right? Because this being Bavaria, they have all these like secret weapons stores. But remember, Hitler is not a communist. He's a radical who wants to overthrow the government, but that's because he thinks the government isn't patriotic. And he doesn't want to be against the military. And so he realizes he has to work. Even though his group, these are like unofficial soldiers, paramilitaries, they have to work with the military. Now, there are three men who were sort of in charge of Bavaria at the time. It's like an emergency government because of the crisis. Gustav von Kahr, he's like the state commissioner, something like governor, kind of, with extraordinary powers. A guy called Lossow is in charge of the local units of the army, or the Reichswehr. The Reichswehr is the regular army. Remember, there are a lot of irregular armies. This is like the official one they're allowed to have. All the other ones are illegal, basically. Caesar is in charge of the police. So you've got three men who kind of rule Bavaria. Hitler wants to work with them. And his idea is, look, I'll be the leader in a political sense, but you guys will all have important positions, and what we'll do is we'll all, gather up in Munich, and we will march on Berlin together. This is 1 year after Mussolini and the Black Shirts had staged their famous March on Rome, when the fascists came to power in Italy. So they're kind of trying to mimic the Italians in a way. The Italians always have lots of style. Instead of black, though, their color is brown. They have brown shirts. Now, these guys don't want to do this because they think Hitler is, like a lot of people, he's a corporal. He didn't even rise up to very high rank. Frankly, he looks like a barber or something. He doesn't really look like a kind of Prussian general or even a Bavarian general. They think he's a little bit of a loon, frankly. And so they kind of conspire behind his back to undercut him. Hitler learns about this. He learns that they're going to have a secret meeting at one of those beer halls, the Bürgerbräu-Keller. Has anyone been to Munich? Maybe you've seen the pictures, you got those like liter steins of beer. Well, it's like that was Munich. Everyone goes to these beer halls at night. All the politicians meet, the conspirators meet. Well, Hitler learned they were meeting behind his back. And so he took the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, and he surrounded the beer hall. And he went into the beer hall, and surrounded by his personal bodyguard, including an assistant called Schäuble-Richter. Anyway, he goes in there. He very dramatically picks up a stein of beer, for which he paid like 4.3 billion marks or something, right? He takes a big swig of beer, and he jumps up. I wish I could jump up on this table, but I can't. So instead, I'll just jump up. He jumps up, and he says, "Aha! The national revolution has begun! We have surrounded the hall." And, it's like this weird political theater. People don't know whether to laugh or to cry. This crazy man, and he used to go around with like a whip, and he had like a gun. And to get their attention, because at first they didn't actually pay attention to him, he actually literally shot around into the ceiling. Boom, he just shoots off his gun. And then he takes these guys into the other room, and he says, look, unless you and I all march together on Berlin, I'm going to shoot all of you, and then I'm going to shoot myself. I've got four, actually he said 5 bullets, because Schäuble-Richter. So I've got 5 bullets, and I'll kill all of you, and then I'll kill myself. So they say, well, all right. But they're not really with him. They're not really with him. The next person to enter the scene is Ludendorff, who had literally been almost like wartime dictator, but he's kind of beginning to lose his marbles a little bit. And so he comes in, and he's sort of unhappy, but he says, well, we should all stand together. And he thinks that since Lossow is an officer, that this oath is, German officer will not go back on the oath. And so Ludendorff and Hitler eventually make the mistake of leaving the beer hall. And then these guys basically team up against them. And the next day in the streets of Munich was a scene of immense drama, even more dramatic than the beer hall putsch itself. Ludendorff, this great Prussian general, walking with like his uniform and all of his medals. Hitler, Schäuble-Richter, Hitler's bodyguard, and about 100 or 200 Nazis. They're all marching down, like literally through like the Marienplatz, and then eventually they turn into another square near the center of Munich, where they run into the Bavarian police. Someone fires, no one is entirely sure who fired first, and you had a bloodbath. The legend has it that Ludendorff didn't even duck, that he just kept walking. Because he was like this proud Prussian general, but I don't think that's actually true. Hitler fell to the ground, and a lot of people use this against him. But it wasn't entirely his fault, because his bodyguard jumped in front of him. Like those guys do in the movies where the president gets shot. Like his bodyguard literally dove in front of him and wrenched his arm out of socket as he was diving. And then Schäuble-Richter, who was one of Hitler's closest aides, he was the consul to Erzurum in the First World War, who actually is one of the key witnesses the Armenians have always used to make their claims about Turkey. Schäuble-Richter was shot in the lungs, and so he died immediately. So Hitler got very lucky that he wasn't shot. He mysteriously was able to escape, with basically like his arm, broken, wrenched out of socket. But he did make a recovery. They arrested him, but they didn't really punish him. The reason this is all significant in the long run is that, first of all, if Hitler had died here, obviously, all of history might have been different since 1923. No Second World War, quite possibly. The other thing is that Hitler learned that he was not going to come to power in terms of some illegal putsch. Hitler basically learned his lesson. Now, he shouldn't try to behave like the communists. He shouldn't try to overthrow the state. Instead, his goal would be to take over the state from within, legally, in terms of elections, parliamentary politics, and maneuvering. So he learned a great lesson there. But meanwhile, the world had very nearly come back to World War, because if Hitler had marched on Berlin to overthrow the government, to repudiate the Versailles Treaty and the reparations, then probably Britain and America would finally have had to go along with France, and then they would have put down the German government then. Instead, the beer hall putsch turned into a legend and something of a fantasy. I know I ran through the first hour, so we'll take, what time is it? 30? Oh, okay, good. So we'll take the usual break, about 10 minutes. And when we get back, we'll pick up with the Allies. As the stab in the back legend. I'm also going to write one more term up here next to Hitler. We're going to use this key term. It's one of his favorite phrases, the quote-unquote November criminals. Now, I already explained a little bit last week some of the international context of this rise of anti-Semitism and paranoia in Central Europe, especially in Germany. A much larger factor, though, at least that was particular to Germany, was the way the war had ended, or to put it more precisely, the way the war had ended compared to what people's expectations were in Germany. Now, if you remember, earlier in 1918, that is, before Germany had lost the war, she had in effect won the war in the East. Remember, Russia had surrendered. Germany had severed huge portions of Russia. Almost the entirety of European Russia, including its most prosperous areas, most of its coal-producing regions, also where a lot of the iron deposits were located, where most of Russian heavy industry was. Germany had essentially ripped. When you put all of this together, along with the stuff about Wilson and the 14 points, with the Germans, remember, somewhat cynically had decided, oh, well, maybe we'll surrender if the Americans will give us a deal. So that a lot of Germans thought they were going to get a much better deal at Versailles than they did. Then you also put that together with the cynical way in which the German generals, particularly Erich von Ludendorff, had decided to surrender power to socialist politicians right before the end of the war. That is, so it wasn't the generals who surrendered, you see. It wasn't the army that was beaten, you see. It was the politicians. It was Friedrich Ebert, the Social Democrats, and of course the Jews, quote unquote. Yes, there were many Jewish socialist leaders. Ebert himself was not Jewish. Many of the other top leadership were. This is where this whole legend originated. The German phrase, very evocative, is the Dolchstoßlegende, the idea that the German people, I suppose the army and then by proxy the German people, had been stabbed in the back by the politicians. That is, the Germans, through their own courage and bravery and feats of arms, had won the war, and then the politicians had lost it for them. The politicians tore Russia apart and not annexed it technically. They were running it through a series of satellite states. But essentially, Germany seemed to have won the war. German propaganda, as you might expect, heralded all of this as a great triumph and a feat of German arms. Germans who read newspapers thought they were winning the war, with fairly good reason, right up until the collapse in September, October, brought about mostly, again, because of the morale problem, the collapse in morale wrought by the arrival of 4 million Americans. The term I didn't give you yet, but which is kind of a funny term. The Americans were called dough boys, dough being what you use to make bread. If you've ever seen that commercial, you probably haven't because it's American, for the Pillsbury man. You know, they sell these little bread rolls, and he's like, well, we got all this fat. He's kind of jolly and fat. Anyway, this was the cliche. You know, the Europeans have been starving for 4 years, and then these well-fed, they're not fat, they're sort of like fit but, you know, full-bodied Americans come over, the doughboys. You know, just shocking everyone with their weird enthusiasm and excitement about the war. Germans, of course, basically went the opposite way. They kind of collapsed and didn't want to fight anymore. All right, there is a lot of material to cover today. I mean, in a way, there's only one real subject, at least for the first half of the lecture, which is the genesis of the Ruhr crisis. You should definitely write this term down of 1923. But to explain it, I'm going to go through the whole saga, basically leading from the Versailles Treaty up to the dramatic so-called beer hall putsch of November 1923, to explain how it all goes together. You know, how you get from the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty, the reparations payments levied upon the Germans, to eventually a major diplomatic crisis, a tremendous political drama, money being pushed around in wheelbarrows, and eventually Hitler jumping up onto a table with a beer stein in his hand. So we want to basically explain how you get from one to the other. I should have written one more important term here. That being the Dolchstoßlegende in German, which we're going to anglicize, had surrendered to the Allies. Hitler's phrase that he liked to use, he called them the November criminals. November 1918 being, of course, the time of the armistice, November 11th to be precise. That is, that these evil cabal of sort of Jewish come socialist politicians had surrendered to the Allies unjustly, thus stabbing Germany in the back. It was all, of course, a gross, a preposterous lie, considering the fact that it was the generals themselves who had essentially abdicated authority, had essentially fled, so in order not to take the responsibility for the defeat. The Allies, in fact, had occupied the main bridgeheads of the Rhine River, thus basically were waiting to pour into Germany. In fact, it's an interesting what-if question. You have to understand when you look at this that people are always fighting the last war. You can begin to see in some of this controversy the seeds of the policy in the Second World War, which will be the opposite, the policy of unconditional surrender. That is the policy that FDR and Churchill and then Stalin decided on. That is, we will not let the Germans squirm away again, claiming they weren't really beaten. So what they did, of course, in the Second World War is they flattened Germany to the ground.